Welcome to Cinepro, where we bring your favorite movies back to life with quick recaps, hidden details, and everything you missed. The movie begins in a terrifying forest with tall trees blocking most of the sunlight, except for a few rays that manage to break through. Suddenly, a dirty hand grabs a tree, and then we see a teenage ghost wearing a yellow hoodie running frantically. The person appears extremely exhausted, to the point of collapsing to the ground after running for a few minutes. He leans on his knees and hands, his fingers digging into the ground as he gasps for air. In the next scene, we see a red bus driving down an empty road surrounded by tall trees. Inside the bus, Nolan, a teenager wearing a gray hoodie and headphones, is looking out the window as the bus moves. We notice a teenage girl sitting in the seat next to him, sketching in a notebook. Nolan glances at her and smiles shyly, clearly showing he has a crush on her. The radio announces an upcoming lunar eclipse, and the driver lowers the volume before turning to the teenagers and asking if they plan to watch the eclipse. Carl, one of the teenagers, confidently says he saw something about it on YouTube, while Quinny, the girl next to him, says she'll watch it with her dad. The two start bickering for a moment before calming down. After a minute of silence, Reggie, a teenager with a nose piercing sitting alone at the back, crushes an empty can and throws it at Nolan, hitting him on the head. When Nolan turns around, Reggie teases him, and Nolan turns his attention back to Bess, the girl he likes, who smiles at him. The kids joke around for a minute, and after the laughter dies down, Joe asks Bess if she'll watch the lunar eclipse. When she hesitates to answer, Carl laughs and nudges Quinny, teasing Nolan and Bess. Quinny gets annoyed and abruptly moves to sit at the front, away from the two boys. The radio continues talking about the lunar eclipse, describing it as one of the longest and most spectacular eclipses. Reggie mocks Joe for driving slowly. The bus continues down the road, entering a darker path where the tall trees completely block out the sunlight. In the middle of the road, there's a fallen tree. Instead of turning back, Joe reverses the bus and takes a smaller, hidden path through the trees. The bus continues down this road, eventually emerging onto an open but deserted area with no trees or signs of life, and a thick fog blankets the surroundings. The kids look out the windows nervously, the fog obscuring their vision. As the bus moves slowly forward, they reach a narrow road with sparse trees and are forced to stop again because of a dead deer lying in the middle of the road. Joe gets out of the bus, warning the passengers to stay inside. He begins dragging the animal off the road. The group considers helping him but decides against it. Joe drags the deer to the side of the road into the trees, pausing to wipe his hands before something makes him stop. The teenagers joke around in the bus as they wait for Joe to return. Carl starts telling a funny story to his friends but is abruptly interrupted when Joe returns with a gun pointed at his head. The laughter stops instantly, and all the kids wear the same terrified, confused expressions as they see a strange-looking man following Joe. The man greets them menacingly, the gun still aimed at Joe, and orders everyone to sit down. Joe asks them to stay calm, assuring them the man won't hurt them. The gunman ignores Joe's words, shoving him and ordering him to sit and drive without saying another word. He gives the same command to the teenagers, who all sit quietly, except for Reggie, who stubbornly remains standing for a moment before returning to his seat at the back of the bus. The armed man directs Joe to the driver's seat and orders him to drive as the doors close. Carl suddenly remembers something as he looks at the madman in front of him, and the scene flashes back to a few days earlier when Carl was having lunch with his father, Chris. Carl was telling him a story about how he helped a girl defend herself from bullies at school. Chris didn't seem to fully believe the story, but let Carl continue. The story was exciting but implausible, and Chris maintained a polite expression to show interest. When Carl tried to describe how he defeated the bullies, he accidentally spilled something on his dad's tablet. While Chris cleaned up the mess, a news story appeared on the screen, showing the face of a criminal. Carl asked his dad about it, and Chris explained that the man was a serial killer who had escaped from prison. He assured Carl they were doing everything they could to catch him because he was insane, ate tongues, and was obsessed with teenagers. Chris teased Carl, saying he could handle the escaped criminal just like he handled the bullies at school. Back in the present, Carl's eyes widen as he recognizes the armed man as the escaped criminal. The day turns to dusk, and the bus continues moving. Pedro, the gunman, orders everyone to throw their phones out the window so they can't call for help. They quickly comply, except for Reggie, who defiantly stares at him from the back seat. Joe pleads with Reggie to do as Pedro says, but the man silences him with a sinister laugh. Pedro walks determinedly toward Reggie at the back of the bus, pressing the gun to his head and assuring him it's real. After some insults, Reggie finally gives up and hands over his phone. Pedro snatches it, complaining that teenagers are like zombies, and orders everyone to sit back and enjoy the ride. The bus continues moving slowly as darkness falls. Outside, signs indicate they are entering entering an abandoned military zone. Nolan and Bess exchange glances with Carl, silently urging him to knock the gun out of Pedro's hand, but Carl is too scared and shakes his head. They look to Reggie, who sees the gun in Pedro's hand again. This time, Bess shakes her head no. At that exact moment, Pedro turns around, and the two quickly adjust their posture. Pedro asks Nolan for his name, and the teenager hesitantly replies. Pedro comments that his name sounds like a comic book character's, and shares that he used to love comics as a child, though not in a healthy way. He recounts how the first thing he ever stole was a pack of cigarettes and a comic book, revealing his obsessive nature. The bus remains quiet after that as they continue driving slowly until they reach a tunnel with bright lights and enter it. Suddenly, the engine fails, and the bus comes to a halt for no apparent reason. Joe curses loudly, and Pedro stands up, demanding to know what happened. Joe tries to explain as the gun is held to his head, and the gunman orders him to fix the engine. The terrified driver turns the key in the ignition several times, but the engine won't start. Pedro grows frustrated and grabs Quinny, who is sitting nearby. The girl struggles, and you beg him not to hurt her, but Pedro presses against her temple and turns to grab Queenie, who is sitting right behind him. The girl writhes and begs him not to harm her, but Pedro presses harder against her temple and orders Joe to fix the engine quickly if he wants to save her. Joe pleads with him to calm down, but Pedro screams at him to get off the bus and fix the engine. He warns Joe not to try anything funny and also warns the kids behind him before shoving Queenie off the bus after Joe. Joe goes to the side of the bus, starts it up, and Queenie follows behind him. He opens the compartment under the bus and begins to inspect it with a flashlight. The other kids watch from inside the bus, and Carl starts to panic. He tells his friends that Pedro is definitely going to kill them. Bess says they need to disarm the kidnapper to stop this. Terrified, Carl shakes his head in refusal, saying it's too dangerous to take the weapon from him now. Rhea agrees. Joe doesn't seem to know what the problem with the bus is and concludes it's an engine issue, something he can't fix. Suddenly, the lights go out, and the entire tunnel is plunged into darkness. The only visible light comes from inside the bus. Pedro points the gun at Joe, and everyone is terrified by the sudden power outage. As they look around, a strange sound is heard coming from the darkness ahead. Everyone freezes and listens intently. Joe shines the flashlight into the darkness but can't see anything. He leans forward, and Pedro exposes his back with the gun before telling him to check what's hidden ahead. Joe hesitates but offers to stay with the teenagers while Joe ventures into the darkness with only the flashlight for help. Joe cautiously moves deeper into the darkest part of the tunnel toward the sound. Pedro pushes Queenie back onto the bus, and everyone watches Joe through the glass. Joe continues into the darkness, and after a while, a low growl is heard. A massive figure wearing a hoodie rises. The kids behind him start to panic and scream. Joe's eyes widen in terror. He begins to tremble with fear before screaming as the monster grabs him by the chest. The passengers begin screaming and panicking even more. Pedro screams, trying to silence everyone as they rush toward the back of the bus. He orders them to sit down and be quiet, making it harder to manage the situation. He tries to think of a solution, reaches the driver's seat, and discovers the key isn't there. Furious, he curses before shoving Carl and pointing at the frightened teenager, ordering him to retrieve the key from Joe's corpse. Before Carl can respond, Nolan steps up and offers to go instead. Meanwhile, Bess runs to the front of the bus, and before anyone can stop her, she jumps out. Nolan tries to stop her, but Pedro points the gun at him, freezing him in place. Bess cautiously advances toward Joe, trembling. The others in the bus hold their breath. When she reaches Joe's remains, she kneels, shaking, to put her hand in his pocket to retrieve the key. She looks at his face and begins to cry, but is distracted by a distant sound in the darkness. She grabs the flashlight and turns it on. A sudden movement startles her, and she runs back to the bus. Pedro takes the key from her and orders Reggie to start the engine. Nolan asks about Joe, and with a negative shake of her head, she says he's gone. Reggie tries to start the bus, but the engine won't turn over. Pedro begins to lose his patience and threatens to shoot the others if Reggie doesn't start the bus immediately. He threatens to start with Queenie, whom he mockingly calls Four Eyes. Reggie, upset by the insult, stands up and threatens Pedro, telling him to stop pointing at Queenie like that. In a moment of distraction, Nolan sees an opportunity. He quickly shoves Pedro, allowing Reggie to grab his gun. With the roles reversed, Pedro steps back momentarily, and Reggie points the gun at him. But in an attempt to provoke him, Pedro starts insulting Reggie, saying he won't pull the trigger because he doesn't have the courage and is a coward. Something hits the bus, momentarily distracting the teenagers. This gives Pedro a chance to regain his gun. This time, he points it upward, and the teenagers start crying and trembling with fear. Pedro jumps off the bus and begins yelling for the monster to come out of the darkness. After a moment, his call is answered. As soon as he sees the monster, he freezes in disbelief and smiles nervously. A loud noise from outside startles the group. They gather in the aisle, listening to the loud gunshots outside. The girls scream loudly and the boys curse. The panic escalates as Reggie makes things worse by turning on Carlo and shouting at him. Nolan tries to calm him down, but the argument continues until the girls intervene. The fight is interrupted by a strange growl right outside the window. As soon as they see the monster holding Pedro's corpse in its hand, they start screaming and huddle between the seats. The monster growls angrily, and the group notices its massive claws embedded in the man's head. After realizing they're in danger, they try to figure out how to survive. Reggie, upset, goes to sit in his usual seat at the back of the bus. The radio turns on, but they can't understand what the other person is saying. While trying to listen, Reggie suddenly feels dizzy at the back of the bus. He stands up, turns to the rear window, and presses his hands and face against it before collapsing back into his seat. In the next scene, the group hears the familiar growl signaling the monster's approach. They huddle together, turning toward the sound. They start screaming as the bus begins to shake. We see the monster's long, clawed fingers opening the door. Their screams intensify. They run toward the other door, and Reggie struggles to open it. Bess grabs the flashlight and shines it at the monster. This seems to have an effect on it, momentarily holding it back. Finally, the door opens, and they escape. Bess leads the way toward a door she had seen earlier in the tunnel. They find themselves in a shelter. After walking for a while, they find a room and decide to stay there after Nolan checks it thoroughly. On a wall beside them, Nolan and Bess find a drawing that appears to be a floor plan of a military fortress. They decide they need to find the control tower to turn on the lights, but Reggie doubts they'll find it. They start talking about Joe, and Reggie tells the others that Joe knew his father. Here we learn that Reggie's father is in prison. Reggie adds sadly that his father is innocent and is serving time because he was wrongfully accused. Nolan takes the map off the wall and gathers his friends. He points to the control room, and Bess offers to go with him. Nolan is pleasantly surprised. Reggie wishes them good luck before the two set off to find the control tower. Along the way, they have a heartfelt conversation. Nolan takes the opportunity to compliment her drawings. He tells her about his mother, who used to paint, and how her favorite painting was of a blue sea by the ocean. Back in the safe room, Carlo makes drumming sounds and gestures as he counts everything he wants to say. Between the strikes, Reggie pauses, but he doesn't listen to him, and it's clear they're having a silly argument. Queenie interrupts the two and says she needs to go to the bathroom. The two choose Reggie to go with her, leaving Carl to continue making noise. We return to Nolan and Bess, who are searching for the control room. They find a massive machine that turns out to be a giant spotlight. Bess comments that the plan clearly didn't work. They aim the beam toward an inner cave where a corpse lies. Reggie and Queenie walk a bit, but before Queenie chooses a spot to relieve herself, she tells Reggie to turn around and move away. While she's busy, Reggie tells her she looks cute when she's angry and that he plans to make her angrier. He expects a response, but nothing happens. Reggie calls out to her, unsure if he should turn around or not. Eventually, he decides to turn around and discovers she's gone. Panicking, he runs back to the safe room to call Carl. Meanwhile, Nolan and Bess continue exploring. Bess eventually calls her friend, letting her know they've found the control panel. Reggie and Carl keep running and calling for Queenie. Reggie blames himself repeatedly. Finally, they find her in a dark pit, screaming under a creature that appears to be eating her. Reggie bravely runs toward her and points the fire in his hand at the creature to scare it away. Carl manages to take Queenie to a safe place. Once they catch their breath, they remember Reggie and go back to look for him. Carl calls out to Reggie, who is now in trouble with the creature. Something drips from the creature's mouth onto Reggie's chin, appearing to be blood. Fortunately, before anything happens, Bess and Nolan finally manage to press the large button, lighting up the entire dark pit. Carl smiles in relief, knowing his friends activated the generator just in time. In the control room, Nolan and Bess find a small ladder leading downward. They enter a cave covered in newspapers and drawings of the creature that killed Joe. They discover books and notebooks revealing that someone was obsessed with the creature. Nolan finds a picture of his young daughter and begins piecing the story together. They rush back to tell their friends, but suddenly stop in a dark pit. They see the shadow of someone approaching and wait fearfully to see who it is. Thankfully, it's Reggie. They both sigh in relief when they see Queenie injured. Carl starts rambling about what happened, but no one can understand him. Nolan calms him down, and Bess examines Queenie's wound. Queenie has a deep gash, and Reggie admits he was wrong to leave her alone. He tries to convince them to leave, but Bess explains they can't. The group heads to the control tower and finds the corpse of a man named Julius. Nolan leads his friends underground and tells them everything about the man. He explains how Julius became obsessed with the creature, which he called the Night Wanderer, after it abducted his sister. Nolan reads from Julius's notebook, and we see the story unfold. We flash back to Julius as a young boy wearing a yellow hoodie, walking in the forest with his sister. They love each other and go on adventures together. Nolan reads the story as we see Julius distracted, not noticing his sister walking toward the entrance of a tunnel. The girl sees something ahead, freezing in place. Julius notices, but it's too late. A scream echoes from inside the tunnel. Terror grips Julius as he takes a step back, his eyes fixed on the tunnel and what's inside. Another scream, this time from the creature, makes Julius look back and run. Exhausted, he collapses to his knees, crying. Later, we see Julius in a police car, clutching his sister's notebook. The scene shifts to Julius at 50 years old, holding the notebook to his chest, unable to erase the incident from his mind. Determined, he enters the tunnel to find the creature that killed his sister. Surrounded by candles, he sketches out a machine he plans to use against the creature. In the next scene, we see him building his project, drawing inspiration from his sister's photo. In the present, the friends reflect on the story story of the desperate man who risked his life to kill the creature. They theorize that the creature is parasitic and won't stop hunting Queenie until it finishes her. We see how Julius met his end in his underground room after his radio attracted the creature. The teens devise a plan to continue what Julius started. However, Queenie is upset, not wanting anyone to be harmed because of her. Her friends reassure her that no one will be left behind. They share a group hug before getting to work. They test old equipment, draw up plans, and work together to power up the spotlight. Finally, they create a plan to trap the Night Wanderer. They take Queenie to a safe place and put their plan into action. They lure the creature into the safe room using Queenie's bloodied clothes near the light source. She grabs the clothes as planned, and they suddenly turn on the light, injuring it. Reggie bravely confronts the creature, buying time for the girls to escape. Queenie and Bess manage to flee the tunnel, looking back to see the creature screaming at them but unable to leave the tunnel's darkness. The boys rush toward them with torches, trapping the creature. They corner the Night Wanderer and set it on fire, watching in satisfaction as it burns. In the next scene, Nolan narrates how courage was the lesson they learned from their ordeal and how it will stay with them forever, even if no one takes it seriously. In the final scene, police officers investigate the tunnel. One officer enters the safe room with a flashlight, but a scream makes him stop and look around. He encounters something. His flashlight goes out, his eyes widen, and his screams echo throughout the tunnel. And that's the end of the movie.